So I often think it's a miracle if any pastor's kid grows up and still follows Jesus in a lot of ways. The psychological threat of war does something to you in a different way that actual war does, but that kind of psychological threat of you don't know what's coming, you don't know how bad it's going to be, is quite an unpleasant thing to live under.
In today's episode, we're joined by Carla, a youth ministry advisor based in Lebanon. She works with churches across the Middle East and North Africa, helping young Christians living as religious minorities to build resilience. Originally from the United Kingdom, Carla grew up in a multicultural pastoral family. Today, she shares inspiring stories of young believers living out their faith despite pressure and persecution. Carla, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you, Gordon.
We haven't seen much of each other in the last couple of years, but we saw each other several times over about 4 or 5 years before that. Yeah, and it's good to reconnect.
Good to see you again, exactly, yeah. In another place in the world where neither of us live.
That's absolutely, that's true. We've never met in a place where either of us live. Yeah. So you and your husband live in the Middle East?
Yeah, we live in Lebanon, in Beirut. We've lived there almost exactly 6 years.
6 years. Wow.
Yeah.
But you're clearly not originally from Lebanon.
No, what gave me away? I was born and raised in the UK and so in England, and then my husband is from Northern Ireland.
Wow. So you're a truly British couple.
Yeah.
Irish or?
Yeah, I'm a little bit more complicated of a mix.
In what ways are you complicated?
My dad is ethnically British, and then my mom was born in the UK, but her parents are from the Caribbean. I don't know if I quite qualify as truly British.
Okay. So that's a really complicated marriage. Your English father who grew up in Brazil and your mother who was British but of Jamaican heritage. Yeah. That's a really complex ethnic mix.
Yeah.
What did that mean for you as a child?
Yeah, it's complex. So I was born in a slightly more multicultural area of the UK, and then we moved when I was very young to an area called the Cotswolds in the UK, which is very like white British, white. There was a sort of sense, and my father is a pastor is another important factor. So there's an element of growing up where there's a lot of pressure to be very perfect as minorities. I think
as a pastor's daughter, even more.
Yeah. And when you're as like the only mixed race family in the town and you're the pastor's kid and people know like the church he's a pastor of, there's a lot of whatever you do reflects on them.
So the pressure is from the church to be perfect.
Both, I would say. Family. I think there is a kind of, and I think especially for my mum who maybe had some of that baggage growing up. Her parents were of the Windrush generation.
Faced all that racism.
Very intense racism, but that kind of sense of we cannot let them be right about us. Okay. So we have to be perfect. We have to be totally beyond reproach. And I think my mum probably carried a bit of that into my upbringing in terms of, even if she didn't articulate it in that way, almost this sense of people are almost expecting us to be worse, or they have assumptions about people from different places. And she had this sense of, but we have to prove people wrong and we have to be perfect and we have to not. So there's elements of that. I think a lot of, I don't know, like I talk to a lot of friends from similar backgrounds, especially like people who are like second generation immigrant kids and stuff. And I think there's a lot of that sense of that pressure to be perfect. And then it's compounded if you're also a pastor's kid. So, yeah.
Wow. That's a lot to be growing up with as a small child.
Yeah, but I think it's also, I often think it's a miracle if any pastor's kid grows up and still follows Jesus in a lot of ways.
Why do you think that?
I think you get a front row seat, don't you, at like the worst things that happen to a church or the worst things that a church leader goes through or deals with or even does sometimes. And so I think there's a lot of people who can grow up like in that level of the church who can just be very burnt by the church, and they see things that happen to their family, or they see things that people say about their pastor parent and stuff. And I think there's a lot of pastors' kids who go on a little bit of a journey where they either have to find their own faith or they walk away altogether in a way. I don't know. It's just something that I observe from.
How did you find your own faith?
So I grew up very much a part of the church community, fully at every service, one of those kind of pastor's kids at every youth group meeting, this kind of thing. And then I think when I was about 15, 16, I wouldn't say it was like a huge rebellion I had, but I was just doing the things that teenagers do, where you get offered stuff, you don't say no, you try everything once, see what happens. And I had friends who were not Christians. I think I was one of the only Christians in my school and stuff. And so my friends were not Christians. So there was, it was just a life that like basically my parents didn't really know much about, or if they did, they pretended well, they didn't know what was happening. And then I think when this was happening, and then alongside, I was still in the youth group. So I would be going to youth group one night, and then the next night would be some kind of party that my parents thought was a sleepover, and then I was actually drinking all night in a forest with my friends, like this kind of stuff, like regular teenage stuff for a lot of people of my generation anyway. But then I remember also just being signed up to, I signed up, I must have signed up to this, but it was a mission trip to Kenya. And so this was happening alongside, and I remember, and I went on this trip and I had a lot of fun, and I really saw the faith that people had and really took it seriously. And it wasn't like that was the pivotal moment for me, but it did make me think, maybe I should just try reading the Bible and see what happens. And I wasn't a big academic, I wasn't a big reader at that time, but I just picked up the Bible and I read the whole thing in about 3 months because I was just so amazed at what was inside it. And it just, so many new things made so much sense to me. And there was a lot of things where I'd grown up hearing words like grace and forgiveness and Jesus died for your sins and all of that stuff. But none of it really, I didn't have any context to it. And reading the Bible from the start to finish was really something quite amazing, because suddenly I had context to all of that. So even like reading through Genesis and then getting to Leviticus, and I remember really finding Leviticus amazing, which surprised me because people always said, oh, Leviticus,
Right.
Exactly. And then like reading about all the kind of laws about sacrificing animals when you sin, and I was like, that's what it means that Jesus died for your sin. We don't have to do that anymore. Like when that kind of element of the wages of sin is death and stuff like that is how it comes from that. So many things just fell into place for me at that time when I was reading through it. And just, like I just loved it. And ever since, it's just been, I've read my Bible every day. I usually read it through cover to cover once a year at least. And that's just been a rhythm that really transformed me. And I think that was when my faith really changed. And when I think it was just like, there's no coming back from this, basically. So
interesting you describe yourself as not a big reader and not academic, and then you go on to talk in a way that reflects the Carla that I know, who is a real thinker. You're a real thinker. You don't just accept things, you look at things and question them and then think about them quite deeply. Interesting that you would have done that as a teenager. Was that?
Yeah, I was 16 when that happened. I was 16 when I read the Bible through for the first time.
You've ended up, we'll come back to your youth a bit more in a minute, but just to make a connection to some of what you're doing now. You're working with youth now, with young people, teenagers and others. And as you were talking about, you try things as a teenager, I was sitting here thinking about the opportunities to try things that teenagers have now, which are beyond frightening. Do you want to say anything about the pressures on young people nowadays and the frightening opportunities that they have with free access to the internet and all that?
The smartphone has changed everything. A very good book I read recently, it was called The Anxious Generation. I forgot the name of the author. I think it's Jonathan Haidt who wrote it. But he basically talked about how the smartphone has completely changed everything for Gen Z and Gen Alpha in terms of what it is to grow up with that kind of access, not just to the internet, but to this kind of world. And you often read these amazing statistics about Gen Z. We think, oh, it's great. They're getting into less car accidents. They're drinking less. There's less teenage pregnancies. There's like all of this kind of stuff. But like one of the things that he argues is that, this kind of presence of the ever presence of the smartphone has meant that it's a lot easier for young people to just withdraw from society and into an online world in a way. And so there's a lot of things where young people are still being offered all kinds of things, but almost in a more like anonymous way, and in a way that means that you are engaging a lot more with an online world and engaging a lot less in a real life world, and which is a lot less safe in so many ways, because I think in real life, if you're in the context of a community, even though you might do some stupid things in that community, there's also a level of safety in a community that's known, that's real, where maybe your family are also on the periphery of it or a part of it directly. There's some level of safety in that. But online, the community is a lot broader. It's harder for people to really know you. You have no idea.
In the community.
So there's a lot of things that are very different now for Gen Z and Gen Alpha than there was for, like, you know, how it was for me. I'm 31 now, so just to give some context, for me, like 15, 16 years ago as a teenager. I live and work now in the Middle East and with young people in the Middle East and North Africa, where the society is still very communal. It's still very tight-knit. But even then, there is still this kind of a lot of that temptation to withdraw online and to see your life through the lens more of online than in reality. So there's a lot of different elements of that are very challenging. But it's a very interesting sort of thing where you see, okay, if you're seeing less teenage pregnancies, but the rates of pornography addiction among young people are higher than they've ever been. They're getting offered all of this stuff online, and like the real thing in person looks less attractive as well when you're having all of this online, which creates a lot of relational dysfunction in many ways too. So
we'll come to the Middle East in a moment.
This episode is sponsored by CrossMap. If you're looking for a place that fills your soul and strengthens your faith, then visit crossmap.com, your trusted source for inspiration and life-changing stories from people of faith. Do you have your own story to tell? CrossMap Blogs is a welcoming place to launch your own blog, publish your testimony in Christ, and share stories that glorify God and edify his people. And while you're there, sign up for the CrossMap daily newsletter and get top Christian videos, inspiring devotionals, and stories from other content creators to strengthen your faith, delivered straight to your inbox. Be encouraged, be a part, be blessed. Visit crossmap.com.
Yeah.
But thank you for that. The book is by a person called Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, The Anxious Generation. It sounds really good. But thank you for that little diversion.
Yes.
No, I asked you to take it, and thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. So back to your teenage years, you then become a follower of Jesus.
Yeah. And life just really changed after that. And I think it was I remember soon after I'd finished reading the Bible and coming across these verses in Nehemiah 4 that basically talk about there is so much rubble, it's impossible to rebuild the wall, and in this context of rebuilding after the exile, the city of Jerusalem. And so God says, stand in the vulnerable parts of the wall and protect your people, protect your brothers and sisters, protect your wives, husbands, sons, like all of this kind of stuff. And I remember I wouldn't even say I had a sharp level of discernment at that point in my faith. I remember thinking, that's what God's called me to do, to stand in the vulnerable parts of the wall, stand in the vulnerable parts of the church, and stand with brothers and sisters. Soon after that, my dad went on a trip with an organization that supports the persecuted church, and he went to Egypt. And I remember he came back with some stories of the teenagers that he met. I think there was a girl who was killed for her faith by her family, basically. And it was just a story that obviously horrific and horrifying to hear when it's someone your age and who is of the same faith of you. But I remember it just very much challenged me about how seriously I'm going to take this new knowledge I have about God, basically. And so I often think, and it got me onto a journey of walking with the persecuted church, praying for the persecuted church. So I often think of myself as being discipled by the persecuted church as a teenager, just through these stories and things like this. So that was how, And then I had a big plan.
Just unpack that a minute. What do you mean by being discipled by those who are being persecuted?
So it was a lot of, I suddenly just fell down some kind of rabbit hole of stories of the persecuted church from around the world, and stories of people who just refuse to give up their faith no matter what, and of people under pressure. And there's something relatable as well in that. And we often don't like to see, we like to think, no, there's no such thing as kind of persecution in like the West and stuff. And it's very different. But I think everyone who has been a believer in the West understands what it's like to be the only Christian in a room or something, or to be made fun of for your faith, or to just feel a small sense of it's not cool to be a Christian. And so there's an element where these stories relate in that sense of there's people who are marginalized in a completely different way, who refuse to give up Jesus, and they have this understanding of why they refuse to give up Jesus. And they share these incredible stories and these amazing things. And it really just helped the Bible come even more alive to me in a way, because it looked a lot like the New Testament. When I was reading that, it looked a lot like the context that Paul was writing to. I remember someone I used to work with said the New Testament was written by persecuted Christians, for persecuted Christians, in the context of persecution.
Remember that same quote?
Yeah, exactly.
We've heard that together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's very true. And it has offered so much to my understanding of the Bible, even at that age, understanding that. So that's, how I feel I was discipled by the persecuted church as an older teenager.
You then went on to do some other things for a while.
Yeah. So I had big plans when I was a teenager. I thought I was either going to be an artist or an actress and stuff. And then
can imagine both, actually.
Yes, I can. Maybe there's still time. Who knows? But I think just because I started to love the Bible so much, I just started to consider what the option, what if there was something I could do in my future. I didn't really know. I don't think I even understood the word theology at that point or anything, but there were a few courses I saw that combined like art and theology, or art and biblical studies at some universities in the UK. And I applied for a lot of these. And I remember my dad saying, but if you don't get accepted into those, like maybe think about seminary or Bible college, as it's called in the UK. Just have a think about it. And I was like, yeah, Dad, whatever. Yeah. It's fine. And then
sure, Dad, sure.
Yeah, exactly. Ignored all that advice, as you do when you're 17, 18 and know everything. But you did say that. And I remember on the day that all the applications for university had to be handed in, and the university system in the UK at that time somehow completely erased me from their system.
Oh.
And I couldn't apply to university, basically, because it was like a kind of clerical error on the system that they said had never happened before.
Oh.
And I'd missed all of these deadlines. And because these deadlines were set by all the different universities, it wasn't going to be possible. And then my dad mentioned the Bible college thing again. And I thought, let's have a look at this. And then I ended up going to a Bible college and studying theology and cross-cultural studies that, just really sharpened that sort of, those sort of things that God, I think, had started to sow into my heart, in that kind of year of walking with him.
And then you met your husband, and
so I think while I was at Bible college, I think I just continued to pray for the persecuted church, particularly for the Middle East. I think that was the thing, because it was always on my heart, the Middle East. And I remember I would often just be praying for a country, and I wouldn't know why I was praying so much for a country. And then the next day you would see that it was like, okay, this has happened in Egypt, or the revolution's happened in Egypt. Or I'd be praying all night, and then the war would happen in Syria.
Wow.
And then I'd be praying all night, and then ISIS had come to Iraq. It was a very odd thing.
Wow.
Where I'd be praying, God would give me a heart to pray for something, and then you'd just see something on the news the next day. I think I just continued like just being a prayer for the Middle East, basically. But I think sometimes God says, hey, maybe be the answer to your own prayers sometimes. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I left Bible college. I knew I wanted to someday, I had this sense that maybe God does want me to be and play a role in some of the prayers I'm praying, but I couldn't see how that could happen in the Middle East. I'd studied theology, which is so useless. And as a woman in the Middle East, you can't be a priest, you can't be a pastor in the Middle East. So I was like, what on earth is this for? Terrible. What have I done? But I ended up getting a job answering the phones at a charity in the UK that works with the persecuted church. It was meant to be a 3-month job. And then I ended up staying a lot longer than 3 months. I stayed 3 years in that role. So and it led to, I was doing a few different things. I started with their youth team, basically going around churches in the UK, speaking to youth groups about the persecuted church. And I remember at that time just really understanding that the persecuted church had discipled me, and really wanting it to be for others to have that opportunity to be discipled by the persecuted church as well. And it was wonderful at that time, but I knew, I was like, I really feel like God wants me in the Middle East. Like, I really believe that still. So it was a dream I'd still held on to, essentially. And then, all life was continuing on as normal. My husband was finishing his PhD in Oxford, and that's where I met him, through the church there. And on our first date, I was very direct. I'm pretty sure God's going to move me to the Middle East at some point. I was like, and this is probably me being as off-putting as I can possibly be, but it really separates the wheat from the chaff to do that early on. And so
it wasn't put off at all.
No, he was like, wow, she's different. And so I think he was intrigued in the way you're intrigued about weird things. And so I just thought, okay, let's see where this goes. That's interesting. Yeah. And then a few kind of kept praying in the back of my mind. And I think after we'd been dating for 2 years and I'd been in this role, serving in this persecution charity for 3 years, suddenly this job came up for a partner ministry that was essentially a youth advisor for young people in persecution in the Middle East, North Africa. And I was like, oh my goodness. I remember just seeing it. I was like, that role would be all my dreams come true. Yeah. That is me. And then I looked at the qualifications. I thought, that's not me. I don't have any of that. And I remember showing it to my boyfriend at the time. And he was like, that is absolutely you. And so he helped me write my CV. And then I had my interview and they said, we really love you for this role, but would you be willing to move to Lebanon? Mm-hmm. And I was like, interesting. And they're like, what would stop you from moving tomorrow, was what they asked me. It's like, I've got a boyfriend. I should probably notify him that was happening and stuff. And then, so we had this conversation and I said, they are interested in hiring me, but they want me to move to Lebanon. Then Steve went quite quiet for maybe a few days. He went quite quiet for, and then I think he'd just finished his PhD. He was looking at kind of fellowships in Oxford. He was looking at all these different things. But then he said, hey, there's also stuff I could do in Lebanon as well. There's a really good university there. And I said, oh, so if we both go, we should probably get married. Yeah, we probably should. So it was these crazy 6 months where I'd started this. So I started the role just before we moved to Lebanon. So I started this new job. And then we got engaged a month later, and then we got married a few months later, and then we moved to Lebanon. And it was in the space of maybe a bit more than 6 months, January to September, of this
pretty
happened.
Intense.
It was very intense. None of the marriage books say to do that in your first year.
How did your parents react to all that?
I'd just been banging on and on about the Middle East for years. So they were like, she's just finally going. Goodness, she'll stop going on about this. So I think my dad especially, like, he understood. And I think he saw the calling in me. He saw what was in my heart. He saw that this was very unusual and not like my usual phases that last maybe a few months or a few weeks or something. And that this had been something that had been on my heart for
10 years.
Yeah, about 10 years by that point, and which is unusual for someone from a teenager till you're in your mid-20s.
Yeah.
You don't really, you're not the same person by then, but that was something.
And brave of Steve to.
Oh, my husband's a very brave man. Yeah. And it's a big thing for someone to have a PhD from Oxford to be like, he had just this, I think we often talk about this, and he understands that I perceive it as a calling and he sees it as a calling, what I have. But for him, he says, he wouldn't say he's necessarily called to Lebanon or the Middle East, but he felt very called to be married to me. Therefore, we then take on each other's callings, whatever that looks like, which is a really big thing, because I feel like you remember just thinking, I don't see many examples of that coming from the men always. I think I see a lot of examples of like women supporting their husbands in their calling and articulating that. But I remember just being so amazed and overwhelmed at my husband at being willing to do that, and just how beautiful that was, really.
And very affirming for you, and especially in the Middle East, as a woman in the Middle East.
Yeah.
That affirmation of the importance of your calling, all that from within the home is quite a big thing.
It is a big thing. And God's really blessed him for that as well. And I see how, like, in his work and in his life and in his world, like, I see that God has given him a lot of wonderful things because of that, and has blessed our marriage in that sense as well.
And let's move to what you're actually doing in the Middle East. You're helping churches to help young people under pressure to build resilience. Talk us through that.
Yeah, I think the way that persecution is often talked about, it's very, when you ask people what persecution is, often what they'll say, it's when a church is attacked, or it's when a pastor is attacked or put in prison or beaten or something like this. And it's often through quite like a male adult lens. We sometimes talk about persecution, but actually, like when you look at what's going on in the church, that persecution impacts people differently. It impacts women differently to men. It impacts young people differently to adults. It impacts children differently to older youth. I think there's a sense of you need to strengthen the entire community to have a resilient community. So you can't just be strengthening the pastors. If you want a church to be resilient in persecution, like everybody needs to be resilient and strong in that sense. So my role is to essentially advise churches or local faith-based NGOs how they can build resilient youth in their context in persecution.
How do they do that?
A lot of it is understanding that for young people, the faith journey is different for young people. So I think with adults, there is this ownership of faith quite often. There's a lot of like maybe Christians who are on like different kinds of faith journeys. But for a lot of young people, they haven't necessarily made up their mind fully, but they're still in the church. They're still very much part of the church community. And they're there by association. So like an adult could decide, hey, this is too hard. I'm going to just stop going to church. And then like maybe the persecution element will stop, this kind of thing. But for young people, you don't have that kind of agency over your life so much, especially not in the
14, 15, 16.
Yeah, exactly.
But in a more pressurized context.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the faith journey looks very different. But young people, even if they don't have that extreme conviction of faith that some people will have, they will still experience persecution because of it, which is very challenging when you don't have necessarily, because I think when you do have that conviction, you can put up with a lot. And I think there's something Viktor Frankl says where it's like, if someone knows the why, they can deal with almost anything. He says it better than me, but it's the kind of phrase, you can endure anything if you know the why. But for young people, it's a little bit different. And you're in the Middle East, especially, quite often your faith and your religion is so tied in with your ethnicity. Mm-hmm. And so you're not only a religious minority, but you're an ethnic minority.
Okay.
And so I remember when not too long after I'd started this role, and I was praying about what does this look like and how are we supposed to serve in this kind of context. And I remember being woken up at night, and I think God just asked me to read the book of Daniel again. And I was looking at Daniel's situation, and he's with his three friends. He's been in Jerusalem. He was one of the elite young men in Jerusalem. Suddenly Jerusalem falls and he's taken away by the Babylonian Empire. And we just see all of these ways that the empire tries to put pressure on him, basically. So you see, I think sometimes when we read it, we could think, oh, Daniel and his friends, they were really favored. Look, like Nebuchadnezzar, the king wanted to give them all these lovely clothes, all these nice things, this like wonderful education, like this food. It's amazing. They had all of these nice things. But it's not as if they were being given these things by a nice little granny from the village or something. They're being given these things from a powerful emperor who had destroyed their hometown, occupied their land, taken them like off into captivity. And so when you see that, there isn't an empire that's just doing this out of the goodness of their heart. It's all about making these young people think, speak, pray, become completely Babylonian, become a tool in the empire themselves. Because there's nothing more almost insulting to a people that you are occupying than taking the best of their young people and turning them into the very thing that they hate and fear. And so you see that was happening with Daniel. The goal was to basically make them become these weapons of the empire, essentially. And I was reflecting and I was just thinking, this is so what pressure looks like for young people. Everything around them is trying to basically take away their identity as Christians and make them conform to the world, essentially, to make them speak, pray, think like the rest of the world. Like with Daniel and his friends, even their names were changed. That meant these beautiful things about who Yahweh is. They were given names that reflected Babylonian gods and stuff like this. And so there's this kind of profound attempt to change their identity in that sense. And you really see that pressure for young people around the region. So like in education systems I think for every single country in the Middle East, North Africa, except I think for Lebanon, your final grades depend on a certain amount of Quran memorization. and stuff. Like there's lots of these elements in culture where you're reminded you're a minority. And this message is very clear. It's like you either conform or you be destroyed, or you don't get the things that the majority have. And that was the same message that we see Daniel and his friends had in the first part of Daniel. It's either conform or be destroyed. And so we see that for young people, and we see how the kind of pressure on young people gets so complex as well, because sometimes young people can be treated with a lot of suspicion. And we see when young people are almost given no choice to conform, and it gets very complicated. And then the young people are blamed for this because we're not taking account this context of pressure that they're under. And so that creates a lot of division between the generations and in the community. So a lot of what I do is basically trying to address the relational health in a church, how churches can value youth, and how churches can, even when youth make mistakes and do things that look like conforming to the world, how the church can always be a safe place for them to come back to, that they can never feel ashamed about returning to the church, and how the church can really build them up in that sense. And be a place without shame and blame and distrust and all of these things, and be a context where young people can be restored to the identity that God wants to give them.
And find a safe haven.
Exactly, yeah. If the church was the safest place for young people, can you imagine what that would do? And I think the church has an opportunity to be the safest place for young people, because there's so much unsafety in the world in that sense for them.
Talking of which, you have lived in Lebanon for 6 years, been through a few interesting moments. We were together a couple of years ago when Lebanon was invaded. Talk us through that, and then some of the things that have happened since then.
So when I tell people in Lebanon, people usually can tell after a few, maybe 20, 30 seconds of talking to me that I'm a foreigner. And so they ask when you moved, and I say September 2019, and they're like, are you serious? Why are you still here? You moved then. So we had a month of normal Lebanon, and then this crazy chain of events got kicked off after that. We had a revolution, we had an economic crisis, then there was this thing called COVID people might have heard of, and then there was also
explosion.
The Beirut blast, and that was a crazy thing. We were meant to have dinner right by the port that night. I got mysteriously sick. I couldn't even sit in the living room. I was in bed, and then my husband was in the kitchen, and then our whole living room was completely destroyed.
Storage facility
ammonium nitrate
that exploded.
It was indeed, and I think it was the third largest non-nuclear explosion in history, basically.
And if you had been in a different part of your flat,
so the glass from the window went straight to the opposite side of the wall. It would have gone straight through us had we been in the kitchen. In the living room, but we just both happened to be on other sides of the room. I felt too sick to go meet our friends at the place we were meant to go. I was at my office that I work from, and I might normally be driving home around that time. I came home early because I wasn't feeling well. There were just so many ways that I'm amazed that God preserved us that day, basically. So that was very tough. And I think that was the first time we started to question, did we really move here for this? Did we really move here for this kind of life? Because it had been sold to us as Lebanon's a great place to be. My role was regional. I had to travel around the Middle East and North Africa, but Lebanon's a great base. It's so stable and safe. You could have a nice life there. Meanwhile, and then travel to the difficult places, and it very much changed. in that space. So there's been a lot of stuff happening in Lebanon. The kind of economy continued to collapse, so essentially people lost all of their savings, all of their money. When we arrived, it was 1,500 Lebanese pounds to the dollar. It's now been a little bit more stabilized, but it's 89,000. At one point it was 100,000. So what was essentially $50 would now have been worth $1, if that makes sense. People who were on decent salaries could be earning about $40 a month, that kind of thing. It was a really tough time for the country. And then when things started to stabilize there, October 7th happened. And that also, because Lebanon has always been embroiled in a lot of the activity that happens between Israel, Palestine. And so, that was a whole other element when that happened.
Tell us a little bit more about
Yeah.
that, about what that's like on the receiving end.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly when it was we were together, but it was around that time.
I was in the country when October 7th happened.
Right.
I remember I preached in my church that day, and then it was like the news broke. It was either later that night or the following day. I can't remember, but it was...
This was October 7th, 2023. And this was the Hamas attack and taking of hostages from Israel.
Exactly. And I think we were all holding our breath in Lebanon because we knew what that would mean for Palestinians. We knew what that could mean for Lebanon. We knew that certain militias in Lebanon would probably get involved because it would be weird if they didn't. If you know any of the history of Lebanon, there's a very helpful book called Pity the Nation by Robert Fisk, if you are interested in the history of Lebanon's civil war.
I've read that. It's helpful.
It's devastating, but it's helpful. And it's generally a book that all the sects of Lebanon will agree gives a fairly accurate picture, which is very unusual. But I think no one comes off well in that book. Like the Sunnis don't come off well, the Shia don't come off well, the Palestinians don't come off well, the Christians don't come off. Everyone did bad things during that time. But it's a helpful book in that sense. But it gives a lot of context to the how and the why of the Lebanon, Israel, Palestine kind of relationship, basically. And so when that happened and then Israel really started their bombardment in Gaza, things also escalated in the south of Lebanon as well. And I also was traveling for a conference. I was in South Africa where I saw you, Gordon. And meanwhile, things had looked okay. As I was boarding my flight, it seemed like maybe things weren't going to really escalate. And then as I landed in South Africa, took my phone off airplane mode, and I just saw what was happening on the news, and it was just terrifying for Lebanon. And my husband was stuck there, and I remember just being in the airport, and even though it didn't look like things were escalating at that time, and I've had several of these moments sitting in Beirut airport since then and just wondering, this is surely one of the places that they would hit. Where am I? Like, I am sitting in a place that could just be hit at any moment. And then when I got to South Africa, and we were just talking to my husband, and we were just like, we don't want to get stuck with one of us inside the country and one of us outside if the war happens. And so he went to the UK. He said, yeah, maybe we'll meet back in Lebanon in a week. And then just over the course of that conference, I think I just made the worst first impression I could possibly make to all these people I met for the first time. But we were just in just so much stress, just like glued to our phones, watching the situation unfold, watching things crawl up the border, and just things looking really awful for Lebanon as well. And like at the end of the week, I wasn't able to go back to Lebanon, and things were just so unclear and things were very uncertain at that time. And so we ended up in the UK for a month. And then it's got to a point where there were a lot of things that made us feel like we could go back. So it looked like things were contained to the south. It looked like things hadn't really escalated in Beirut by that point. And so we thought, okay, let's go back, see what happens. So went back for another year. Things were normal, or this kind of new normal. Used to go in the south that we didn't go anymore. And just generally a little bit more careful. But yeah, we tried to get back to normal then. And then things slowly started escalating a little bit more across the year. So there were strikes in Beirut, and there were a lot more kind of things happening, just targets being hit by the Israelis, people being kidnapped by the Israelis as well in different instances. Just a lot of things where it was almost like a slow escalation for a lot of the time. And then things got really bad in the summer. There were a lot more threats.
Right.
Summer of 2024. Yeah, 24. And a lot of it is psychological. I do feel like the psychological threat of war does something to you in a different way that actual war does. But that kind of psychological threat of you don't know what's coming, you don't know how bad it's going to be, is quite an unpleasant thing to live under. And the way that the Israelis do it in particular, I'm just talking about this as it happened. I'm just sharing my experience here. But the way they do it is they really want to ensure that we know that they could hurt us at any point, basically. So one of the things they do is they will fly their jets at such a speed that it creates a sonic boom all over the city. It's often louder than an actual bombing. And I say that now because we've also seen those in real life. Everyone feels it. So if there's a bombing, if you're within a few hundred meters of it, it's very loud and it shakes the building and it's horrible. But with a sonic boom, it can shake the buildings of a much broader radius. So everyone can think they've just been hit. Everyone thinks they've just been bombed, basically.
Kind of psychological warfare is what you're saying.
Absolutely psychological warfare. And so then we were out of the country in the summer for a few weeks. And then again, not sure, should we go back? And then we ended up going back. And then a month later, the situation got just unimaginably worse. The sonic booms were happening a lot. The psychological warfare was still happening. There was still like the occasional random strike, this kind of thing. And then I remember the day really clearly. I remember it was a very boring day, and it was September the 17th, I think. And I remember it was a very boring day in the office. We had to get some like frozen yogurt and ice cream into the office to stop us falling asleep. And then on my way home, I was returning some running shoes to the shop, and then suddenly my phone was lit up with all of these things asking, are you okay? Are you okay? I'd been in Lebanon for 5 years at that point. I usually can tell. I was like, something's happened. Something terrible's happened. And then suddenly, like, the streets were just full of ambulances. And I was going home in this convoy of ambulances. And I saw on the news that all these pages had exploded across the city, including outside of my house in the car park of where we live, basically. They basically said, if you are within walking distance of a hospital, please give blood, but don't drive. If you're in walking distance, do. So I was in walking distance of a hospital. So I went and I donated blood, and I'd just never seen scenes like it. Like, I remember just the journalists crowded outside and just screaming mothers and screaming people who were just horribly injured. Because I think the way that they did it is that the pages beeped first. And so people would get out the pages, they'd want to look at it, and then the pager would explode. So they were missing hands and eyes, like seeing these young people missing hands and eyes just dotted all over the hospital. And I just remember thinking, I didn't even know this was possible. And I remember we were all saying, does this mean our devices can be hacked? Like, we were all thinking, like, in my kind of in the WhatsApp groups, we were saying, like, should we sleep with our phones like outside the room in case they explode? Like, what does this mean? Like, we didn't realize that it was part of a kind of shipment that had been intercepted somehow. So the pages belonging to this militia group in Lebanon had been intercepted by Israel and tampered with to do this enormous operation, basically. And so that was the start of this awful week where there was either, and then the day after, when the funerals of those pager victims were being held, another round of pages exploded. It was just this week, it was being just constant escalation. Yeah.
Talk to us about that.
Yeah, we often get this question. And I think the thing is, every time we think this must be it, we can't keep living like this.
Nothing worse could happen.
Yeah, we can't keep living like this, surely. Like, it's almost like just God provides a way at every turn for us to survive there. So I think when we felt like that in the economic crisis and we were losing everything, God provided a way for us to be okay. When it happened after the blast, God provided a way for us to be okay. When it happened after October 7th, 2023, God somehow made it okay for us to return. And it just continually keeps happening in a way. And so I think when this new escalation happened, and like, it was so much bigger than anything that had happened before. And so I thought, is this going to be it? I don't know if we can, like our threshold surely must be all out war. We can't live through this. And my husband was traveling at the time, and I was inside the country still. And again, like, we had this fear of, I hope we don't get separated. Like, I remember at the end of the week, like when the war had begun, and my boss called me and he was like, I've realized your husband's out the country, isn't he? And then I said, yeah, why? And he's like, okay, you were meant to be on a trip to Egypt. Like later this week, it starts right now. We're getting you on the fastest plane we can get you out of there. So yeah, so then I ended up getting out of the country for a few weeks, which turned into a few months, and we just waited to see what would happen in that time.
And now this year, 2025, has been difficult again. But again, you keep going back. What is it that you love about Lebanon, about the Middle East?
There's so much to love. And when we went back, and I think we very tentatively went back properly. I went back at the end of December, and then we were both fully back in January. I remember, like, my husband just saying, forgot how much I love this place. It's in many ways, it's like a toxic relationship that I'm often like wondering, you think it's got so much potential. It can be, when the times are good, it's so good, but when it's bad, it's really bad. Just, there's so much to love about Lebanon and about the region. And I think especially it becomes even more when you've been through a lot with the country and because you suddenly have this deeper bond with the people in the country, you understand them better. Like we understand each other better now. Like I have friends who will often like make fun of me for thinking too Lebanese now and stuff like this, because you just develop this similar
humor, among other things.
Black
humor,
terrible dark humor I've suddenly acquired that I forget is very dark until I leave Lebanon and people look at me horrified when I say things.
It's a way of coping, isn't it? It's a coping mechanism.
Yeah, it's a coping mechanism. There are worse coping mechanisms, but dark humor is definitely one of them. But it's just like, I love this region so much, and I know that God loves this region so much, and it feels like such an honor and a privilege to work with the oldest Christian communities in the world, and to just still see God doing beautiful things with them, to see people who still love Jesus and have been loving Jesus for 2,000 years as communities. And it feels like such an honor to be part of that. And there's so many wonderful things about Lebanon. I don't know many people who visit Lebanon and don't just fall in love with it in some way.
It's a
beautiful place, and the people are amazing. And there's such a richness of life. Like I feel like life is so full there in such a wonderful way, and life can be so good there. When things are good, it's amazing. But it's
moonlighting for the Lebanese tourist board.
I hope they can't pay me much, but absolutely.
That's part of the tragedy, isn't it? That it was a tourist destination for the region, and now sadly it's not. Carla, we're going to have to begin to wind down. I do want to give you an opportunity to say anything else that you'd like us to hear.
I feel like I've talked a lot. I don't know.
That's fine. Don't have to add anything else. That's been a rich conversation. Thank you very much indeed. Carla, working in Lebanon, helping churches to help young people under pressure, persecuted young people to build resilience, and lover of Lebanon. Thank you so much for being willing to talk to me.
Pleasure. Thanks for talking, Gordon. It's been great to chat. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Faith Without Frontiers. I hope you've been refreshed, stimulated, encouraged, and inspired by the conversation, perhaps even challenged. If you enjoyed today's episode, then please subscribe so that you don't miss the next story of faith in the series. And do consider sharing the podcast with friends, colleagues, or members of your church community. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and strengthen you as you serve Him wherever He has placed you.